On the podcast today, we are going to speak about chapter 76 of the Tao Te Ching, which makes up the 76th episode of the 81 meditations on the Tao Te Ching. And as usual, Guiyang will read Jia Fu Feng and Jane English's translation, and I will read Derek Lin's translation.
We are born gentle and weak, but at death are stiff and hard. Green plants are tender and filled with sap. At their death, they are withered and dry. Therefore, the stiff and unbending is the disciple of death. The gentle and yielding is the disciple of life. Thus, an army without flexibility never wins a battle. A tree that is unbending is easily broken. The hard and strong will fall. The soft and weak will overcome.
While alive, the body is soft and pliant. When dead, it is hard and rigid. All living things, grass and trees, while alive, are soft and supple. When dead, become dry and brittle. Thus, that which is hard and stiff is the follower of death. That which is soft and yielding is the follower of life. Therefore, an inflexible army will not win. A strong tree will be cut down. The big and forceful occupy a lowly position, while the soft and pliant occupy a higher place. So in this chapter, we're speaking about two paths in life, the hard and rigid path of death and the soft and supple path of life, which has many different layers from the literal to the spiritual.
Yes, being soft and being relaxed, having the flexibility has been one of the core principles of following Taoist philosophy. And that's why earlier chapters, Lao Tzu emphasized the importance of being like a newborn babe, right? Just like a fresh bone, very soft and very fragile. And also water analogy as well, like being soft like water. Water always flows down to the lowest place, but overcomes everything, overcomes the hardest objects like old huge rocks, for example. So yeah, that's what Lao Tzu is trying to deliver this message through this chapter again and again. And in this chapter, he make an example of a human body and the trees and plant life and so on.
Yes. Well, if you look at the literal interpretation, when there's no life in a body or a tree or whatnot, it becomes hard, rigid, stiff. Rigor mortis sets in, and there's just no life in it, right? The moisture has left the body, has left the living organism, and it is left dry, brittle, stiff, rigid. And so that analogy, as in the Tao Te Ching, like as you were saying, Lao Tzu is applying that to our own psychological states, but also how we conduct ourselves as societies and armies and governments. For example, if we look at an army, the army that is rigid in its beliefs, too rigid in its method and its approach, and doesn't change when the terrain is calling for change, then they will be the ones who are first outmaneuvered, right? While the opposite army, who can read the environment perfectly and are open and are soft and supple and can change with the rising and crashing tides, they will be the ones who will win the war, so to speak, right? And so that's, again, how we should conduct our lives as well. And this, again, this sense of ease, which relates to Chuangzi, which is that type of Xiao Yao Yu, where it's free and easy wandering or aimless roaming, this ability to have that fundamental ease in life, which allows you to be soft and supple and change with the rising tides, is an advantage that we all have, especially from a spiritual perspective. Because if we are so rigid in our beliefs, we're so rigid in the way that we live our life, then that kind of blocks us from our own inner potential and what the Tao is calling for us in this life.
Yes, stiffness and softness can be easily interpreted in physical sense, just like this chapter about trees that's been unbending will broken first, and the army without flexibility will never win a battle and whatnot. Whereas a gentle and yielding is core principle of life, literally, right? So there is that, and also it actually, more importantly, it can apply to more of a psychological level, as you mentioned, and easily in our life, in our individual lives, that if you are more open-minded, sometimes you can be flexible in your own opinions and ideas and things in life, and even in a conversation with someone, if you're more yielding and more flexible, the conversation might have a more of a fruitful result, right? But if you're stiff and you're not open person and you don't want to truly listen to what other person got to say, then often leading to the argument and conversation becomes very dry and shallow, right? So it can apply in that sort of sense as well, and also in deeper sense that even in people who are in a spiritual path and spiritual practice, and this can apply to that as well. If you are very rigid and stiff in your own practice, that you can't adapt to different practice at different situations, then you become very rigid. You maybe no longer you can call you are in a spiritual path, because being in spiritual path is to be soft, to be gentle, and to be open-minded, right? So yes, you can apply that to more of a psychological state and even spiritual practice.
That's right. The Taoist practitioner is supposed to always remain open. And as you said, even with their meditation practice or with whatever discipline it is that they have, life has a certain way of sometimes mellowing our own rigidity out, especially, if we can hear the message from the Tao. Sometimes we can't, and we stay stiff and rigid in that, and then we essentially stop following the Tao inadvertently, but we think we are following the Tao, when the Tao is always calling for us to change and adapt and so forth and so on. Again, you don't want to exaggerate this. This doesn't mean that you become weak and feeble and people take advantage of you and this and that. It's an internal process, right? And so the Taoist practitioner, or the one who follows the Tao, is what would be called an esotericism, like the occult practitioner. So the one who is completely open and has a mind that is supple and can absorb knowledge and use that to nourish its existence, deepen its experience through life. You don't really have this mentality of that this life is about this, right? Because the Taoist practitioner never has a fundamentalist perspective. And see, that's what can happen to spiritual people, right? They become rigid in their beliefs, and then they have a hard and rigid perspective, and that blocks them from growing. And the Taoist analogy is that if you're ever growing, that means you're alive, right? So that the analogy of being alive is that you are growing. And so we often stunt our growth because we might find a belief system, or we might find a type of teaching that we think answers everything in existence for us, and then so we cling to that, and we lose our suppleness, we lose our softness, and our ability to change and think and ruminate on certain teachings and deepening our experience. Because the Taoist is really, in a lot of sense, like a contemplative scientist, right? Because you're in the art of contemplation, and the contemplation never stops. Especially if you're a sincere Taoist, it never stops, because you are alive and you're continually growing. And so the contemplation only allows your experience to be deeper and deeper and deeper. But you've never came to a conclusion of what this is. It's the process itself, right? It's like the idea that God isn't a noun but rather a verb. So there's this constant process of growing, but never like coming to a conclusion, because a conclusion actually relates to rationality. It doesn't relate to life. What's the logical conclusion of a tree? Well, there isn't. What's the logical conclusion of a goat? Don't know. So life doesn't have these rational conclusions that humans tend to think that there is. So when we talk about matters of God, we will make a statement about God, or we will assume God is a certain type of being, or this and that. And then we build a conclusion about what this is, what we're all experiencing. And that's a massive mistake, because once you make that conclusion, you've put the universe into this neatly defined box, and you live in that box. And so if anything is trying to come into that box, or that field of your own field of consciousness, that contradicts your own perspective, that's when you become a fundamentalist and become hard and rigid. And essentially that's a type of spiritual death. That's when you begin to spiritually die. You become spiritually impoverished, rather than continually nourishing yourself, remaining the contemplative scientist, and continuing to live as one with the Tao. And you got to remember, the Tao isn't an end, it's something that's ever moving. We don't know what it is and why that is, but it's beginningless and endless. So it's like the Tejo Lingam, right, in Shaivism, the infinite column of light, where Brahma became a swan and flew up to try and find the top of the lingam, and Vishnu became a boar and dug into the earth. But it's beginningless and endless. And see, in the story, because Brahma said that he had found the end of the Tejo Lingam, which is completely impossible, that was a type of spiritual death for him.
Yes.
Because Shiva revealed himself to be the Tejo Lingam itself, and said, we both know you're lying. Vishnu at least admitted that he couldn't find the end of the Tejo Lingam. You said you could. And so that's kind of what we are doing. We are kind of committing the crime that Brahma did, where we're saying, yeah, man, this is what it is, but that's actually not what it is, because it's beginningless and endless. How could something beginningless and endless be actually quantified, can be reduced to a statement or this and that?
Yes, I think that's a way of thinking, or contemplation is a very, maybe some people find it difficult, because we live in such materialistic world where there is really the end, and that there's a goal to achieve, and right, that there's a beginning for it and there's end for it, right? And people like to distinctively be aware when is the beginning and when is the end, right?
That's right.
And that is again being very stiff somewhat, right? And without knowing that, people find it hard to find a direction in their life, let's say. Well, whereas, like you said, they're beginningless and endless, so that the process between that beginningless and endless is like a life in a sense, right? So when you truly embrace the process of life, process of basically just a living life, then you can somewhat, we like to set a goal and achieve things for our own growth. Yes, it helps, but we need to be aware that that's not the ultimate, right? Yeah, so being able to adapt in different things and way of living, thinking, and all that is sometimes, I think, unintentionally meeting with obstacles, or sometimes it's also helpful, I think. No one wants to face obstacles or challenges, of course not, but it, again, helps us to grow, right? It's a kind of opportunity to think differently in order to solve that problem, right? Or to adapt the situation, right? If things that you've always been doing is not going to work this time, then we'll have to go around a different way, right? And it's the flexibility in our mind, in psychology, right? So that is important, that we sometimes need to maybe embrace the obstacles and challenges, and we'd like to make the plan and mapped out and everything in the near future, but things might not pan out that way, and you need to learn to adapt to situation and have that flexibility.
Yeah, having, like you said, like that sort of open mind, you can read the terrain without your own preconceived judgment of what the terrain is, and so then you can move in accordance with how the terrain is. You can move, you can be flexible. And this kind of goes back to, like, the individual themselves being limited, right? So the ego itself is limited. And so most of us live within that. And so when we're living within the limited individual, then we put limitations on life itself. So then there is an end, there is a logical conclusion to the world, and so forth and so on. Whereas if you embrace, like, what Jiddu Krishnamurti called the holarchic thinking or holarchic mind, you're looking at the world not through sort of the individual vessel, and the subjective lens, but you're seeing the world as a whole rather than fragmented into certain pieces. Now, you're not just doing this as a kind of rational exercise. You work enough on your state of mind, your own consciousness, that you actually begin to have that state of consciousness, the holarchic state of consciousness. And so when you see the world from that perspective, then you come more into harmony with this reality of this beginningless and endless Tao that is hard for us to think of through the limited vessel. And so it's because we live in that limitation, we make limitations on life itself. So this must have a conclusion. We must understand what this is. That's already a limitation. We must find a philosophy that adapts to this, that can explain to us the nature of God. That's a limitation. God itself is a limitation. The concept God is limitation. And so can we get outside of that limitation and have that holarchic consciousness? And that's the challenge, because like Lao Tzu is kind of trying to push us towards that state all throughout the Tao Te Ching. Get out of the dichotomy of good or bad. Get out of this or that, this type of thinking. Zhuangzi does the same. Vedanta teaches the same. Vajrayana Buddhism teaches the same. But it's a challenge for us to get out of that type of fragmented consciousness where we have a limited perspective of this and that. And then we reduce the world to a conclusion because that makes sense to the limitation that we live within. So our limited ego can understand this then. And so it keeps us safe, makes us feel safe, right? Whereas if you have the holarchic thinking, you remain the contemplative scientist. You are that Taoist practitioner moving with the terrain of life, within your own mind here too, I'm talking about, where things change and then you move with it and then it deepens your experience. Then you're getting closer and closer to what the ancients were talking about.
Yes. You talk about the evolution of perception in your Science and Practice of Humility book, and I think that applies to what we're talking about, as in we are seeing the world as a limited ego's perspective, so that makes the world and your life becomes a limited, or you kind of almost like refuse to do it. You refuse to identify yourself as a person who exists in the world as a separate being, but rather you choose to know, not even choosing to know, you are fully aware and you are fully confirmed that the knowledge of the you are, that the ever-expanding consciousness itself. So when you come from that perspective, then your life and the world is ever expanding the consciousness itself outwardly. And yes, the concept of the world and life doesn't even exist in that level of awareness, right? So ever expanding, ever changing, right? So like, for example, even in Taoism, I Ching literally means book of changes. And again, in Buddhism, Buddha, the famous teaching is that nothing is permanent. Things are impermanent, and things always change. And one thing that is true to this world is things change.
Yeah, that's
yes,
right. Yeah.
That is the only truth, and which is true, right?
Yeah,
like nothing is permanent, nothing is set in stone, but we want to keep things set in stone. That's where actually suffering comes from, right? A lot of suffering and pain that we experience, that we wonder what happened and this and that. But again, that's a wrong way to approach that sort of situation. But when you come from the perception, that elevated perception where you know that you are fully aware, that not as a kind of individual's place, it's more like a total collective place, that we are ever expanding consciousness itself, then we can be more free in the world, right? And you continuously see the world that way, then you can easily adapt to changes, right? Easily adapt to obstacles. Obstacles, no longer you see it obstacles anymore. We judge it as obstacle too, right? So there won't be any that kind of judgment over the matters in life, and you just kind of easily accept just things that happens in our lives, right? So again, that is that, softness and yielding perspective.
That's right. So that accepting things is kind of like a mirror reflection of our internal terrain too, isn't it? It's about, like what we've just been talking about, living through that limited vessel, not having that elevated perception. It's when you let go, finally, then you start to see the world right. You start to come into that kind of expanded state of consciousness because you're not living within the limited vessel. You've kind of let that go. You're not taking your own personal life so seriously, which then you become a reflection of reality itself, rather than being hard and rigid and saying, no, I'm not going to change because, this is who I am, and so forth and so on. The idea of who I am, obviously there are certain idiosyncrasies and that define our persona and so forth and so on. But even that slowly changes over time. And as I've said a million times on the podcast, in psychology, they say if you're the same person at 60 as you were at 18, you've probably gone through a lot of psychological trauma to maintain that state of mind. Mm-hmm. Whereas life itself is constantly there trying to soften you, trying to make you yield to the experience so that you learn more about the ultimate state within and without. Not that there is a separation there, but that kind of union between heaven and earth that Taoism talk about. And so if we don't have that aptitude to let go of ourselves, basically, right? Let go of ourselves. Stop living within the box. I don't want to be limited anymore. How do I stop being limited? Well, just let go of yourself. And once you let go of yourself, life will still continue. You'll still function in the world, but you're not operating through all these rigid systems that block you from spiritual progress. You just need to let those go and become one with that river and allow it to take you to the greater ocean of the Tao.
Yeah, that's a great lesson for everyone to take on board. We all think the life is important. My life is important, right? And everyone's life is important. And then that's when things become too serious and rigid and stiff. And again, that's where we bring all these problems.
Yeah.
From thinking things too important, right? But again, from greater perspective, like let's say multitude of universe scenario, right? Then petty human species actually, just a part of this big huge organism of universe, but that doesn't take any importance over anything, right? So from letting go of things and not taking things too seriously, and then instantly our being becomes very light, right? So that's why we call it enlightenment, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right.
Literally, when you carry too much in your mind, it'll only bring it down too heavily on the earth, right? But if you just let things go, it's just going to get lighter and lighter. That's when we feel very liberated, right? So that's the journey we should take on board.
Yeah, that humility and surrender is definitely important, as you said. Who are we as a species? We think we're the top of the food chain in this universe we live, and I'm pretty sure planets are probably above us on the food chain, and solar systems, and so that's not supposed to be taken as a negative thing. But like in all spiritual paths, it's supposed to humble you, because it humbles you because your life isn't so serious, and your self-importance is not really important.
Yes.
And so it's supposed to humble you, so then you surrender to the ultimate, you surrender to the Tao, and then that allows you to come back into harmony with the Tao, because you're not taking your life so serious. You're not living within that limited vessel. You're searching to become one with the ultimate. And so, guys, we hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you guys next time.